Hello, my name is Sarah Honer, and thank you for attending today's debate between myself and Dr. Honer. Our motion is that the Star Wars franchise belongs firmly under the sci-fi genre. I will be arguing pro today. So, my first point is that science fiction, which is the long version of sci-fi itself, is a genre firmly rooted in the idea of using science or technology as a very important platform for the entire story. That story cannot exist unless you use science and technology as part of it. So, Star Wars belongs to the sci-fi genre because one of the primary elements of every single movie or story you see is that they are flying on advanced spaceships. They are using lightsabers. You cannot tell that story without having it set in outer space with people functioning with advanced science and technology. That's my first point. It has to belong to the sci-fi genre because of the science and technology used within it. All right, the second point is that George Lucas, who created Star Wars, stated that his two primary things he loved to do when he was a young child were read the Flash Gordon comic books and read sci-fi. He absolutely was fascinated by sci-fi as a young man. My argument is that if you are fascinated by something as a young man, when you go to create something new as an adult, you can't help but be thoroughly influenced by what you loved as a child, especially if you're getting to do something independent and creative on your own. All right, the third point is I want to look specifically at a primary character in the Star Wars universe, and that is Darth Vader. He's scary, yes, because he's powerful, but he's terrifying to behold because he is a fusion of science and technology and humanity. His voice is altered to make him terrifying. His face is robotic and metallic. So he could not be the powerful, iconic villain that he's become for us in our time without the use of science and technology. He would just be a man who's crippled and can use his powerful force. So he is that physical living embodiment within the universe of science fiction at work in the story.
Is that it?
That's it.
Okay. I'm probably going to use closer to my full 3 minutes. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today and listening to our debate. My argument is that Star Wars does not belong in the science fiction genre and that the genre of fantasy is a more appropriate genre in which to place Star Wars. If there's one thing I want you to remember from this debate today, it is this quote that you see at the beginning of every Star Wars film. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This is where and when George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, has chosen to set his Star Wars films. And that's very important to understanding in what genre they belong. My thesis is this. I'm going to use a term you might not be familiar with to make my argument. The term is iconography. So you think of the word icon, a picture or symbol. Iconography are the pictures, the images you see in a movie or a film or you read in a book. Every genre, science fiction, fantasy, comedy, every genre has certain icons or images or symbols associated with it. So the technology, the spaceships, the blasters, the droids, the technology that's part of Star Wars and makes it seem like Star Wars belongs in the science fiction genre is iconography. George Lucas was a brilliant man, is a brilliant man, and he did some very specific things in making Star Wars to make it very successful and very popular. And he knew that the spaceships and the weapons, the technology from the science fiction genre would be very appealing to his audience. And so he chose to use the iconography from the science fiction genre. But these are symbols and images. So just because it looks like science fiction doesn't mean it is science fiction, because that technology is not the basis for the films. So what is the basis or the foundation? My thesis is this. We see the images, but the images are not the foundation for the films. The foundation, the important thing, the thing that holds it up is something else. It's not technology. So if we look up the definition of science fiction, we see that science fiction is a film, a show, or a book where the basis for everything that happens in it comes from science. It comes from the theories of science that we as a human race have developed over time. And even though these things may not be real that are happening, science fiction proposes that one day they could happen. It's still possible or plausible based on what we already know about science. Whereas fantasy imagines things outside of reality. It's not real, but the basis for those things in fantasy is not science. It's something else. Maybe it's magic, maybe it's the supernatural, it's something other than science that we know. So it's not really plausible. George Lucas, creating Star Wars, borrowed some of the images from science fiction, but didn't use science as the basis for those things. Instead, he used things we know from fantasy. He used mythology. He uses, the characters in the films use the Force, which is a spiritual or more supernatural kind of a thing. And most importantly, if you compare Star Wars to other things from the science fiction genre, unlike Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica or Planet of the Apes or anything from the science fiction genre, Star Wars does not offer scientific explanations for the technology. Ships fly with hyperdrive, but we don't know how hyperdrive works. They have blasters, they have highly intelligent robots. Again, we don't know how the droids can talk and walk like people because there's no scientific explanation given. And so that's mainly what separates the two. I have more points I'd like to make, but I think I'm out of time, so I'll save them for my rebuttal.
All right, so I so much appreciate Dr. Honer's extensive research and his fandom within this community of the sci-fi genre. What I have to say is that I understand where he's coming from as far as we are not told that hyperdrive works for a certain reason. However, if you look up the definition of sci-fi, what you find is there is no hard and fast definition for science fiction. It's a fluid concept. So I would say what we want to do is look at one of the first authors to ever write science fiction, and that would be H.G. Wells. He wrote The Time Machine. He's well known for several different foundational sci-fi texts. And what he said was that science fiction is something created that deals with what we call the hard sciences. And all other genres such as fantasy, folklore, etc. do not. So a hard science just means that all the science, all the advancements that happen are based on principles that exist in our world and cannot be changed. And so in the world of Star Wars, you don't have technology springing forth that manipulates gravity in a way that wouldn't make sense to us. Everything that happens in Star Wars is something that we could see eventually happening with enough scientific advancement. Therefore, it is based on our hard science. So H.G. Wells would have argued that Star Wars belongs firmly in the camp of science fiction because all the technology you see isn't sprung in magic. Gandalf doesn't come along and just manipulate space and time for people. Everything happens within the realm of pre-existing science.
Okay. So, thank you, Mrs. Honer. I really appreciate the research you've done going back to the origins of science fiction. It shows you really care very much about this debate, very passionate about it. This is actually also, I'm grateful because that's actually going to help me prove my argument. So, this idea from H.G. Wells about hard science, that's actually exactly what I was saying when I gave my definitions for science fiction and fantasy, and said that fantasy, the basis of everything that happens in fantasy is outside of our reality and not plausible in our reality at any point in time. Whereas science fiction, based in the hard science, is one day the things you see in Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica is one day potentially plausible based on the science. So Star Wars has these images, spaceships and blasters, that make us think it's using things that you see in other examples of science fiction that are one day plausible. That's the iconography. But the things you see in Star Wars are actually not one day plausible. We go back to that opening quote a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. George Lucas uses that quote to set Star Wars up as not part of the science fiction genre. It takes place when? A long, long time ago, not in the future. So from the very beginning, it's set up as something that's not entering into a discussion about when we'll develop these technologies. It's also in a galaxy far, far away. The examples of science fiction we know, like Star Trek, take place in our galaxy a long, long time in the future, not in the past. And if you think about the examples of fantasy, you know, Lord of the Rings, Narnia, Lord of the Rings takes place a long, long time ago. Tolkien wrote it as a myth. He wanted it to be like a myth, so it takes place in another world in the past, much like Star Wars. Narnia, they have to travel to another world to get there. That's very much like a galaxy far, far away. And even though Star Wars has these really cool ships and things that help make it so popular, the most important things in Star Wars are not based in reality. And I'm just going to give two quick examples of this and I'll be done. The two most important things, the lightsaber and the Force. The lightsaber is not a piece of technology you would normally see in science fiction because it's a sword. It's not a blaster. So when you look at other examples of science fiction, if they use any kind of sword or, you know, that type of bladed weapon that doesn't shoot a projectile, it's seen as something of the past. And in Star Wars, it's the most important weapon because it has to do with the character development. When Luke first fights Darth Vader, he's not ready. He's prideful, and he loses his hand and he loses his lightsaber. And the huge thing is when he then comes back in the Return of the Jedi and he's much stronger and he's learned to use the Force better, he's made his own lightsaber. But there's no explanation of how he's made his lightsaber. It's much like a magical sword in Lord of the Rings or Beowulf and has that same symbolic significance. And then the Force is a spiritual thing. Mrs. Honer talked about Darth Vader. Darth Vader, it's true, he's dependent on technology to live, and that helps make him scary. But again, Lucas is just using an image to make him scary. That's not the basis for his power. His power comes from the Force. And we know, if you've seen all the Star Wars movies, that when he was Anakin, when he was young, the Force was always the strongest with him. And that's what makes him so terrifying. He's one of the most powerful at being able to use the Force. And so that's not based on technology at all. That's him being able to move things with his mind, which again is not something you would see in science fiction unless there was some kind of scientific explanation. And George Lucas doesn't give us that because it's fantasy. It's another world that he's transporting us to. And so I was thinking there'd be another rebuttal because I made such strong points. But thank you so much for being here today.
All right,
We
that
really
is
enjoyed our
it.
time with you.